Darius Miller never planned to raise 5 children on his own. In 2013, he worked as a night security guard at a supermarket in rural Ohio, juggling bills, schedules, and the little energy he had left. Alicia, his wife, had seemed weary of the routine since the birth of their youngest, but he never imagined that she would leave without looking back. On a Tuesday morning, he returned from work to find nothing but a generic note on the kitchen table. The children were still asleep. It was spring, but that morning everything felt frozen inside. In the first few days, Darius believed that she would come back. It made no sense to abandon the children, but as days turned into weeks and then months, reality forced him to face the abandonment. He set aside any trace of pride and took on every role: father, mother, nurse, cook, mediator of fights, homework helper. There was no time for lamenting. The priority was to keep the lights on, the food on the table, and the children emotionally whole. He sold the car, began walking to work, traded meals for leftovers, and even so, never let them go without the essentials. 3 years passed, and Darius still held on to the questions that were never answered. The children, each in their own way, reacted to their mother's disappearance. Mia, the oldest, became almost a second adult at home. Meanwhile, Jordan, the middle child, began to isolate himself, collecting silences as a means of survival. The youngest, Theo, asked fewer questions as he grew, but Alicia's absence was a constant shadow. Darius avoided speaking ill of her, even when resentment burned inside him. He believed that protecting the children meant sparing them the raw truth, even if that cost him more than he had imagined. The nights were the worst moments. When everyone was asleep, it was as if the accumulated weight of the day collapsed onto him. He no longer cried. He had passed that phase, but he carried a silent pain in his eyes. The hardest part was not the physical exhaustion, but the fear of failing them. There were days when he counted coins to buy milk, other days when he pretended to have eaten just to leave more for the children. Still, he never thought of giving up. To him, loving meant showing up, even when tired, even when it hurt, even when alone. Years passed without any news from Alicia. The routine became both a shield and a prison. Darius could see in his children's eyes that, although they never spoke about it, they carried that absence deep within their hearts. Sometimes a teacher would ask about the mother at a school meeting, or a classmate would ask an innocent question that stung like a knife. Day after day, Darius learned to respond with firmness and sweetness, never allowing the past to become an excuse for the children to feel diminished. He did not want to create victims. He wanted to raise whole adults, even if the world had started off crooked for them. It was on an ordinary Saturday, 10 years later, that the letter arrived. The simple envelope with handwriting he recognized from afar was among that week's bills. Darius read and reread each line, trying to find any genuine emotion in those words. Alicia said she wanted to see the children, that she missed them, that she was ready to be a mother again. She did not explain the reason for her departure, nor did she clearly apologize. It sounded more like a request for reintegration than an act of remorse. He held the letter in his hands for hours, sitting on the living room sofa, while the children laughed in the yard. He felt a tight knot in his chest, of fear, of anger, of doubt. It wasn't just about him. It was about them, about what that turnaround could trigger in a structure he had spent an entire decade keeping upright. Darius didn't immediately mention the letter. He needed to think. The children were in different stages of life. Mia was at community college, working part-time. Jordan was trying to find his way through temporary jobs. Theo was still in elementary school, with a heart that beat too fast for everything. He knew that once the news was shared, there would be no turning back. For that reason, he spent 2 days in silence, sleeping poorly and staring at the letter as if it were an enemy. On the 3rd day, he called all 5 of them together for a talk. They sat in the living room, as they had so many times before, and he simply said, "She sent a letter." The silence that followed was the heaviest in the past decade. The reaction didn't come all at once. Mia's face closed up, her fists clenching, but she said nothing. Jordan got up and left, slamming the door. The younger ones were confused, trying to understand what that meant. It was only when Theo asked if she was going to come back to live with them that Darius felt the real impact. The hardest part was not dealing with Alicia's possible return, but with the reopening of wounds that, although healed, still burned when touched. Seeing his children so divided, he realized that he couldn't simply erase the past or prevent each of them from feeling it in their own way. That woman had left and taken much more than just her presence. She had taken away their references, their emotional stability, a piece of each of their childhoods. And now, she was coming back as if wanting was enough. That night ended without resolution, but Darius knew that from that moment on, he would have to protect more than ever what he had spent years rebuilding. The following week, Alicia appeared. She didn't announce her coming. She simply knocked on the door one afternoon with an expression that tried to mix remorse and hope. She looked different, thinner, wearing simple clothes with a tired gaze. Darius opened the door slowly, not knowing what to say. The children weren't home, and he thought that this was some kind of mercy from the universe. She entered with measured steps as if treading on sacred ground. She began to speak about how hard life had been, how she got lost, how no one had been around when she needed it most. But Darius already recognized that tone. He had heard many drunk customers at the supermarket telling the same stories to justify their own mistakes. He listened in silence, his face expressionless, but his heart alert. In the middle of the conversation, Alicia made a comment about facing financial difficulties. She mentioned that she didn't have a proper place to live, that she was trying to start over. That was when everything clicked in Darius's mind. This wasn't about love or remorse, it was about necessity, about desperation. When she said that maybe it would be good to stay here for a while, near the boys, he felt his stomach twist. He thought of the years of absence, the birthdays overlooked, the illnesses faced without help, the report cards signed only by him. He thought of every night he had slept sitting on the couch because one of the children had a fever, and now she wanted to come back without paying the price. The visit ended quickly. He thanked her for coming, said he would talk to the children, and opened the door. This time he remained silent. Darius didn't want to make any decision on his own. He gathered the children in the same living room as before and told them about the visit. He didn't hide anything, not even the part where Alicia mentioned her financial difficulties. He wanted them to know exactly what they were dealing with. The atmosphere grew heavy once again. Mia was the first to speak, firmly. She said that she didn't feel anger, but she also didn't miss her. She had learned to live without her mother and saw no point in reopening a door that Alicia herself had chosen to close. Jordan said that he didn't want to see anyone suffer again, and that included himself. The younger ones didn't say much, but Theo seemed confused, quietly asking if now she was good again. Darius realized more than ever that this unexpected return could have the power to dismantle everything they had rebuilt. It was then that Darius made the decision that had been maturing in silence. He called a lawyer he had met years earlier at a community fair and scheduled a meeting. He explained everything calmly and asked for guidance. He wanted to legally adopt all 5 children, including the 2 who still had a legal bond with Alicia. He wanted them to be his on paper and in life. The lawyer explained that it wouldn't be simple, especially without the biological mother's consent, but Darius wasn't intimidated. In the same week, he hired a private investigator. He wanted to know exactly what was behind that return. 2 days later, he received confirmation. Alicia had a negative credit rating, owing more than she could pay, and had lost her job. She was living with a cousin, without a steady income. The pieces finally fell into place. This wasn't a reunion. It was an attempt to escape from the life she herself had built. The investigator's confirmation did not bring relief, but a strange sadness. Darius had never wished Alicia harm, even after everything that had happened. He was angry, of course, but he also carried a quiet compassion for someone who had clearly lost her way. Still, he knew that compassion could not come before protection. He couldn't allow guilt or nostalgia to weaken the structure he had spent 10 years building. With the documents in hand, he proceeded with the adoption process. He spoke with each of his children individually, explaining what it all meant without pressuring them. They all accepted, some with contained emotion, others with discreet tears. But what marked him most was Theo's expression, who, after signing the papers, whispered, "Now we're really yours, right?" Darius only nodded, his eyes brimming with tears, unable to speak. While the process was underway, Alicia appeared 2 more times. On both occasions, Darius was polite but firm. He did not allow for long conversations, nor did he permit any contact with the children. After the second visit, she stopped insisting. A month later, a new letter arrived, this time without requests. Alicia confessed that she was unwell, that she truly needed help, but admitted that she no longer knew how to be a part of their lives. She said she didn't want to be hated, though she understood if that were the case. She ended by apologizing for the pain, for the abandonment, for the silence. It was a short, dry letter, but there was something sincere in it. Darius read it alone, on the same sofa where he had sat with the first letter years before. When he finished, he felt neither hatred nor peace. He felt a weight being lifted, not through complete forgiveness, but through acceptance. Sometimes, moving forward was simply understanding that not everything needed to be fixed in order to be left behind. The day the adoption was finalized had no party, balloons, or speeches, but in some way, it was the greatest celebration of their lives. Darius took his children to the notary, one by one signing the papers with a calm that bordered on solemnity. Each signature was like a bond being reinforced, not of blood, but of presence, effort, and love. When it was all over, they went out for hamburgers at a simple local restaurant, just as they did on birthdays. Few words were needed. There was a silent understanding among them, a kind of relief only those who had experienced absence could comprehend. Darius looked around the table and for a moment allowed himself to take a deep breath. That family was real, imperfect, but solid, built on fatigue, persistence, and above all, the daily choice not to give up. In the following days, things returned to routine, but something had changed. Darius no longer carried the weight on his shoulders of someone who constantly had to prove that he was holding everything together. He felt that for the first time in many years, he was living, not merely surviving. The children, despite their own challenges, seemed lighter too. Even Jordan, who had always been more withdrawn, started to speak more. Mia smiled more times in 1 week than she had in the previous 2 months. Theo slept better. None of this erased the traumas or rebuilt lost time, but it showed that moving forward was possible, even with scars. Deep down, Darius knew that the past would always be there, that perhaps at some point Alicia's presence might return like a shadow. But now he was sure of one thing: they were prepared. One day, when he returned from work, Darius found a brown envelope under the door. It was from Alicia herself with no visible return address. Inside, there was only a handwritten letter and an old photograph of the 2 of them still young, holding baby Mia in her arms. This letter was different from the others. It had a sober tone, less justification, and more farewell. She said that she would not write again, that she had finally understood that bonds are not reformed by unilateral will. She said that she loved them, but that loving sometimes meant stepping away so as not to cause more harm. She asked that if the children ever wanted to speak with her, they were free to do so, but that she would not wait for it. She ended with a simple, "Take care of them as you always have, because no one could do it better." Darius read it only once, folded the paper and stored it in a drawer. Not out of anger, but because he knew that this chapter had finally been closed by its very author of absence. That night was silent. There was no conversation about the letter. Darius didn't feel it necessary to show it to the children. For the first time in a long while, he felt that their story was secure. Not perfect, not immune to pain, but steady. While washing the dishes, with the children's laughter coming from the living room, he thought about everything they had been through. The years of loneliness, the sleepless nights, the birthdays when he tried to throw a party with what little he had. He also thought about how every small gesture he had made, cutting a sandwich into a heart shape, placing little notes in their lunchboxes, always being in the stands at school presentations, had been a way of saying, "I'm here." And he realized, with a quiet clarity, that true love doesn't need applause or an audience. It simply happens in everyday life, in persistence, and above all, in the choice. Over the weeks, Darius began to notice small changes in the way his children looked at him. It wasn't something obvious, but it was there, a deeper respect, a quieter affection, almost as if they had seen something before, unnoticed. It wasn't about heroic admiration like in the movies. It was about genuine recognition, about truly seeing who held everything together when no one else was around. One night, while putting Theo's washed clothes away in his closet, he found a drawing taped to the wall. It was a simple sketch, him and the 5 children holding hands, with the words, "Our home is you," written above. That caught Darius off guard. He sat on the edge of his son's bed, looked at the drawing for a while, and let a few tears stream down his face. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude, of a kind of peace that only comes when the pain gives way to reaping all that was planted with so much effort. Even so, Darius did not delude himself. He knew that challenges would continue. There were still tight bills, uncertainties about each one's future, fears that would arise at random moments during the day. But now, he no longer felt alone. The weight that had once been solely his now seemed more shared, not because the children had grown up and taken on responsibilities, but because the love between them had become something concrete, solid, unquestionable. They didn't need to talk constantly about the past. It was enough how they treated each other, how they protected one another, how they celebrated the small victories of everyday life. Mia passing the final exam of the semester, Jordan baking a cake for the first time and being complimented by everyone, Theo learning how to tie his own shoe. It was these little scenes that showed how alive that family was, not by luck, but by choice. Time passed, and the marks of that decade did not disappear, but transformed. The children grew up, each following their own path, but always coming back home on weekends or during tough days. Darius continued working, now part-time, and every now and then he was invited to speak at community meetings about fatherhood and resilience. He never saw himself as an example of anything, but people seemed to see something in him that it took him years to accept. An ordinary man who did what was necessary, even when it seemed impossible. Alicia's absence left gaps that no one else could fill, but his presence created roots so strong that they held everything up. There was no perfect ending, no dramatic redemption, but there was building, and that, for Darius, was worth more than any reunion. On an ordinary afternoon, with the older children already grown, he sat in the backyard with a cup of coffee and the distant sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Mia was telling a story, Jordan was laughing out loud, and Theo was trying to teach something to his nephews, now part of the new generation. Darius looked at it all and understood that the love he built didn't need grand gestures or emotional speeches. It was a love made of consistency, of presence, of difficult choices made in silence. The memory of Alicia still surfaced from time to time, but without pain, just like a distant note of a song that had already ended. He hadn't forgotten what he had experienced, but now that was part of who he was, not what defined him. And in the end, that's what remained. A father who stayed when everyone thought he wouldn't make it, who didn't promise anything grand but gave everything he could, and in the process showed that true love doesn't arrive by surprise, it endures.